during COVID and after COVID, a lot of them are remote, distributed. So what has been your journey there?
The pandemic changed the way of working. Some of the basic foundations of any team, what I call the 3 C's, there's communication, the second one is connection, the third one is
In a lot of organizations where they are trying to do this balance of having the right kind of talent at different locations, they end up creating what we call as the feature team.
because nothing can teach you about your product adoption than watching it being used. You learn the most in the trenches. I think that access to the consumer end customer in a globally distributed setup is a challenge.
Hi, my name is Malthi and I am a product leadership coach and consultant. And I'm the host of Product Talk with Malthi. Welcome to the first in-person show of Product Talk with Malthi. In this episode, I'm excited to welcome Roopa Jayaraman, who is a product and technology leader with a track record of scaling product-led growth for a global B2B SaaS platform. Her areas of expertise are product vision, innovation, go-to-market strategies for taking global products at scale. Thank you, Roopa, for joining us in today. Really glad to have you. To start with, what I would like to ask you is that you have kind of, leading large distributed teams. So what has been your experience of, building and driving such large teams, especially, during COVID and after COVID? A lot of them are remote, distributed. So what has been your journey there?
So obviously, if you look at it, right, the pandemic changed the way of working for good, I would say. Some of the basic foundations of any team tend to be, in my mind, what I call the 3 C's. There's communication that's very important, and this communication needs to be 360 degrees. The second one is connection to the organization, to the larger purpose. And the third one is community, because the amount of time all of us spend at work, it's very important that there is a sense of community and belonging. So all those three aspects, the pandemic shook up. Right? So suddenly, things we took for granted ended up being something we had to manage completely remotely. So different organizations have taken different techniques to address it. Of course, early pandemic stage, health and safety, super critical. So I think all of us decided to put that front and center and making sure our employees are taken care of. But I think post-pandemic was a very, very interesting time for most organizations. And again, without just jumping into one of the two camps, there are two polarized camps, right? Organizations who vouch for in-person, organizations who say, okay, I'm going to be remote. We took a slightly more poised approach, I would say. We watched what the data was telling us. We were looking at product companies across the world as well as in India. And then we took a call that, okay, let's kind of do a best of breed. And we now follow a hybrid model, where we strongly believe in-person connection is needed. So we have organized our teams around 2 days in person. And this 2 days in person is really the time to collaborate with your teams. Because if you're building a product, I think it's a team sport. Right. You know that really well. There is a lot of sparring, a lot of creativity, thinking that needs to come together. So we've kind of made space for that in-person collaboration, if you may, but also manage it with flexibility. So then, you have employees who can balance the best of both. And I think that's been, in my view, the right model that works for us as an organization. Of course, different companies have different perspectives. I think hybrid's been definitely interesting. And speaking of the future of work, if you look at the studies, there are a lot of studies coming out. In particular, if you look at the research done by Nicholas Bloom, he's a Stanford economist. He studied, I think, about 1,000 organizations, okay, right? And started to address the key myths, right? And the myths were around productivity and trust and things like that. And I think one of the things he came out of it saying was, it's better not to polarize. It's better to choose what works for you as an organization. But definitely some form of in-person connect is the way to go, especially if you go back to my 3 principles of having connection, communication, and community. Nothing actually replaces that. So I think for me, that's been something that's still work in progress. We're still learning and adapting. But I would say that's where we've landed as a strategy.
Okay. Yeah, I love the 3 C's part, right? Yeah. So I think I'll kind of double down a little bit on what you said, right? Especially product companies, right? Product teams, rather, if I can double down. there is a lot of, when you're building a product, there are a lot of collaborations needed. They need to, there has to be that healthy debate in person, and that happens, right? So, I mean, and the good part is that right now we are all at an inflection point in India where we are building products for India. We have building products for the world. So I would say back, probably 2008, 2009, when you and I started our product management journey to now, I think it has grown up like multifold, maybe 10x or maybe much more than that, right? So what have you seen, right? I mean, in a lot of cases, what happens is that your actual customer is sitting somewhere else. Your stakeholders are sitting somewhere else. So the remote teams, have to come together. There are a lot of cultural nuances, time zone challenges. So what have you seen as the key challenges, and what do you think has worked for these remote teams to, bring in results?
So I think if you look at it, right, at the heart of any kind of product management strategy is the customer. So, or consumer science, knowing how your end user is going to interact with your product. What kind of problems are they facing that they want to solve with the product? So I think that access to the consumer end customer in a globally distributed setup is a challenge. But if you look at it, organizations have solved it, because now products are being built in different corners of the world for global consumption, right? So they're all global products. Right. I think there, the routines and rituals matter. So, of course, what the organization's North Star is important. But once you've set the North Star and you know what you're going to do for the market, routines matter. I think there, getting close to the customer really through doing some deep research of what the customer needs, that, if you ask me, doesn't have any geographic barriers, right? Starting to talk to the customer and virtually having discussions with them, understanding their customer journeys, how are they interacting with it in terms of if it's the user experience, if it's the automation they seek, if it's in terms of regulations they are trying to deal with. I think there, the customer experience and research, the boundaries have blurred. It's no more I sit with the customer and do an interview and meeting. Of course, that's important. But how do you do that even virtually, given you have global teams? I think that's the first part. I think the second one is iterative build out. So as you're building out, I think there the principles haven't changed quite a lot, right? It's making sure you're innovating with the customer, showing them what you're building, getting those feedback loops going. In the context of organizations I've worked in, I think the most powerful ideas have come through ongoing demos of the software, right? When you're watching the customer play around with your user experience, you might have just launched your beta workflow as an example. How are they interacting with it? And that we have good tools to record and play. We have good tools to watch the customer give real-time feedback. I think that's how you bridge that barrier of that physical co-location with the customer. I think the other thing I would say is with global products, right? One of the things that's become very clear is customer experience globally also has some common denominators now. Our end users, generational end users, have some basic kind of needs from a product. Now, that's now fairly documented, whether it's heuristics, user experience, the amount of digital clicks that a customer wants to do, whether it's in a desktop or in a hybrid setup on a tablet or a mobile. I think that, to a large extent, has that knowledge been democratized. So I think that definitely helps teams to build globally. I think last but not the least, I don't want to take away from the fact that innovating close to the customer is still not important. I think that's where getting those feedback from field teams. So your field teams are working very closely to the customer, but making sure they're connected to your product development team. So that way the field teams are giving real-time feedback, whether it's customer support teams or customer success teams or teams that are actually deploying your software for customers. That connective tissue is very critical, because that's when you get the rapid feedback loops. And for me, structuring your team to address this is important. So having a very, very strong feedback loop between your product development team, consulting teams as we call it, and customer support or experiencing teams, those three teams, if they're not talking daily, we have a problem. Because that's when you kind of understand the day-to-day adoption of the product. So that's where the structure comes in. You need structures which are not siloed, structures that allow for frictionless flow of data between the teams that touch a customer. Because I think oftentimes this is the unfortunate myth that the product team knows all. It's not true. When you sell a product, you have different customer touch points within the product life cycle, and each touch point is important. starting from the sales and marketing to how you develop the software, how you deploy it, and how you manage it post-production. Super critical, extremely important in B2B, equally important in B2C. So just having connective tissue there really helps.
Yeah, no, I think you kind of nailed down a very beautiful point, right? That how can these touch points, like whether it is your sales or marketing, I think they kind of ensure that teams are not working in silos, right? But I think despite that, right? I mean, one of the things which I mean, I have been a remote PM all my career, right? And it takes a very conscious effort from the organization, especially from the leadership, to make it happen at every level, right? So what are some of the things that you have seen around you that has worked so that the product teams, especially the remote teams, which are not very close to the customers, are not always hearing it from proxy representatives, but actually have the access to the real customers? So, and also I would ask, also from an organizational structure perspective.
No, absolutely. So I think here, organizational design is very important. If you don't have an organizational design that allows for rapid feedback loops, I think it's very difficult, even if as a leader, we say the right things to say, hey, we are customer first, there's customer centricity. It doesn't translate into reality if you don't have the right org structure or the rituals, as I mentioned, to drive this kind of a mindset. So for me, I've seen a couple of models work. The first thing is making sure that there is constant triaging between the groups that touch with the customer. How do you do the triage? Now, the triage can be one of two types, right? One is making sure that when you are working with the customer in the trenches during a product implementation, what I've seen work is bring a product team along. Okay, it's easier said than done, because you're telling your product team, allocate some of your time spent, right? You have to build new features, but you also have to learn how your features are being used. So allocate some of your product team working with the frontline teams to see how a product's being adopted. So almost force it, right? So their hybrid structures work, team hybrid structures, especially when you're taking a new product to market, which is not mature. Create a hybrid team that has your product team along with the team that's deploying. Whether you call it consulting, professional services, it does not matter. But make sure that you have that two-in-a-box setup and they are deploying it together. Because nothing can teach you about your product adoption than watching it being used. You learn the most in the trenches. You can wait for your NPS survey. Of course, it's very important, but you can know earlier where your product's succeeding and failing if you're in the trenches with them. So the way I have seen this work is force that. Force hybrid structures, especially when you're in early stages of productization or your maturity curve is in the early stage from an adoption perspective, force that. The second thing, and this is something that it's not something that everybody wants to do, but I think it needs to be almost forced, is ensure your product team is addressing customer support tickets. Make sure that your product team has access to the tickets and is supporting it, because that last mile adoption that you need for a product oftentimes gets missed. Not missed because someone is intentionally missing it. It's just context that's missing. So I think to get that 360-degree context, you have to be entrenched in those kind of touch points. So because you will know what the operational users of your system really need. So you're obviously going to know what your business stakeholders are going to need, because that's why they chose the product, right? You will know what the key ROI levers are. But beyond ROI in the day-to-day usage and where you have adoption touch points, I think you'll have to force that into your routines and almost force that structurally. The last thing I would say is ongoing feedback from customers. This needs discipline. Like, as product managers, we live and die by the NPS survey. We live and die by certain user metrics and userization metrics. But I think how we are adapting those metrics is very important, because I've seen great metrics and data emerging from your usage analytics, but they've not made it into your product roadmap, right? So forcing the org and your product team in particular to say, here, one of the channels of your feedback has to go back into an investment. You have to show change in the 12, 18 months time period with feedback that your customers have given is another forcing function, which is not just listen and say, sure, I'll do it, but actually do it.
Take action.
Take action, and the way you fix that is in the prioritization lifecycle, allocate a channel which is more direct customer feedback, which you need to build. Roadmap is very important, innovations are very important, but I think that's where you have to balance BAU and innovation. And responding to your customer needs, is, as far as I'm concerned, is hygiene. BAU, you have to do it to stay relevant. So that balance is needed in the way you prioritize and build.
Yeah, you just take me back to, one of my leaders used to say that
Yeah.
it is not only the job of a product manager to be high on customer empathy,
Yeah.
but everybody in the team who's
Correct.
building the product,
Yeah.
like the thing you spoke about, listening into the customer calls, recorded calls and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
But while these are definitely very good practices, Roopa, in a realistic reality, there are a lot of people involved, right? There are a lot of cross-functional team involved here, right? So what I gather from what you said is that there is this whole definition which needs to be put in structure, and then there has to be an enforcement where you can start seeing the result. But are there beyond, between defining it, the structure, and enforcing it, what are some of the, hoops through which people have to go through, and what could be some of the challenges over there?
So the hoops are many, right? So if you look at it, so we talk in the product world about cross-functional teams. You're like, hey, let's have full stack team, cross-functional teams. It's no more 4 in a box. You have a product or manager, him or her sitting separately, dreaming about from an ivory tower. You have an engineer who's focusing on software. You have a compliance person who's thinking about the legal ramifications. And in some cases, you have a third person who's testing the software. I think that way, most progressive organizations have realized that it has to be cross-functional. Everyone's coming together and they're solving the same problem. They're solving the same problem, which is implementing a feature or a capability for the market. I think that cross-functional thinking, there are organizations who are doing it really well, but there are still organizations who say they are cross-functional, but behind the scenes, you will see it to be quite siloed. So that is where I think needs to be very, very intentional, that you create those cross-functional structures, right? Whether it's a cross-functional feature team. Very common thing is have a cross-functional feature team. Do not segregate the 4 in a box, 3 in a box. Create cross-functional teams. I think that forces people to start to work together and see the same end goal. But think about the incentive structures. If you peel back and if you go to some of the teams that are there, they still have a job to do, which is their own craft, which is I need to write good quality code, or I have to make sure my customer test cases are tested, or I have to make sure that my training content is in place, so on and so forth. There I have seen a couple of models work. Okay, some of the things is making sure that this team comes together with aligned to a business value. There are many good methodologies. People use scaled agile, they use product program increments. I think there are a lot of great methodologies, but they have to be adapted to the context you're with, and then driving the team towards that outcome so that siloed thinking is getting broken day in and day out. Not that we are just saying once in a year that, hey, it's a cross-functional team. In the day in and day out trenches, it changes. The other thing I will tell you, and this is where that segregation between business and tech has to break. Because I would challenge that within the teams, as much as you may be an engineer or a technologist in the team, you have to know your market, your domain, and customer, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of training and unlearning that's needed, because think about some of the genesis of these roles. It's been entrenched in just focused on code and technology tools. You have to elevate it with a product thinking, and that's on the technology side. On the business side, sometimes it's the same thing, which isn't, dream of the future, but make sure that it's in fact feasible. What is the technology choices that will help you take something to market? I think there, the debates have to be had, because it's never going to be the same mindset. And that's the diversity we seek.
Exactly.
We want people to come from diverse perspectives, but guess what? They need to be bound by the vision that what I'm building, it needs to go out to the market fast. It needs to be sticky. And in fact, the customers will come back and going to license it again. So I think that forcing function and having these roles have the necessary debates and allowing as a leader for the debates and talking openly about trade-offs, right? To say, hey, yeah, you wanted a user experience like this, but guess what? That's very expensive from a performance perspective, right? Can we do something like this? I think over a period when people are trained to think with a cross-functional mindset and the customer experience first, I think that muscle can be built. And I think it's a muscle to be developed. It doesn't happen instinctively, I've seen, because everyone has their own craft, and bringing them together needs this constant reinforcement.
I agree. Yeah. And yeah, beautifully said, right? I think it is about First is, kind of, I would say, spreading the knowledge of domain, let's say from business to tech. And similarly, the feasibility of what is really possible or not and educating your business on that side of things, right? I think that's what take the organizations together, right? Another aspect, which I have like personally experienced, and right now, for example, in India, there are tons of, products which are being built from India, for the world. And of course, there are a lot of other geographies where we have these distributed teams, right? So lot of times what happens is that, for example, if you're catering to most of the companies definitely have their presence in the North American market.
Correct.
Right? So what happens is that there is a lot of first-hand information, business decisions, where you have access so you understand the details, right? So how do you think organizations where you have a lot of these business related discussions, proximity to customers in one location, and you have your team, which are your feature team, sitting in a very different location, right? So how do we make that osmosis happen, right? So what has worked for you, and what have you seen that?
So I think it's basically a fundamental thing. So the minute you need to be a global company, you need people who are open to some form of mobility, right? I'm not talking about permanent mobility. So as a leadership team, we need to focus on making sure the person who's close to the customer, right, is getting all this amazing insights, right, has one of the incumbent part of their roles is to make sure they are sharing that knowledge and sharing that knowledge with the full context, not it crystallized into a one-liner saying, don't worry about the customer, can you just build me this? The minute you have that kind of a discrystallization to a level that the context is lost, I think you're in trouble. So how do you solve for this? I think you solve for it in two ways, right? Making sure that people who are close to the customer, who have that first-hand experience, are traveling or spending enough time in the trenches with the feature team. It's the same thing I told about the feature teams being in the trenches with it's the reverse. Make sure that there is structures and budget supporting that, right? And making sure it's a priority for anyone frontline, right? This is what you're saying. Frontline product owners, spending time with the feature teams, and force context. How do you force the context? You force the context through processes, right? Making sure that the business context is codified in your stories, and the business value, if you're doing a program increment or a product program increment, make sure everyone's very clear and crystal on the 4-5 liner on why are we building this? What's the customer pain point? So that's a very process-oriented hack. But I'll go one step further. Process helps it sustain. But what is needed is the structures, specifically in the frontline product owners, to understand your product's going to be so much better if you spend time on providing that context. So I would almost think about it as, why do you want to have one brain? Think about it as a two-brain structure. You have someone in the front line, you have someone building. The two brains have to come together for the maximum outcome. And that you have to be very, very mindful of the type of people you hire. You have to make sure that the culture supports this kind of osmosis. And the third one I would say is, as leadership team, it has to be demanded to say there is that intentional knowledge flow, because if we have the intentional knowledge flow, the product's going to be better. Because I think the negative of it is, if we crystallize and remove context, how is it possible someone building 500,000 miles away to build something that's needed and it fits the customer purpose? It defies the construct. So I think that's the thing that has to be almost like a forcing function through the way you structure your teams, as well as drive the necessary incentive structures and feedback loops to force that, creating that customer empathy, even though you're not actually watching and seeing the customer, right? So I think that has to be forced.
Yeah, no, I love the part that you said, right? It is very important that there is that intentional investment
Both
from
sides,
the person on the other side who's with the customer to give the full context, because only then this person who can develop things will be able to do justice to the amount of insights that has been derived from that. So that is only when it becomes like a win-win situation.
Absolutely.
And the organization can, I would say, maximize the potential of running those multiple teams.
Yeah, because for me, I always tell my teams, right, and the global teams, that the beauty of productization is that it has a multiplier effect, right? If you do something really well, it can multiply. You can have a lot of happy customers. If you make mistakes, that's also expensive because multiplier effect. So you have to start to think like that and believe that each of these communications that you have, interactions you have, are going to in fact add value, or we're going to create debt in the system which should be avoided, which is build a feature which can't be used. It's like the fundamental debt, and it's a very common debt a lot of products have because of this loss in translation and loss of meta context.
Exactly.
So I think that's the part where it has to be reinforced.
I agree. Probably going a little bit more deeper over there, right?
Yeah.
More from a execution per se, if I may say, is that largely, I think we all start with process first kind of a thing. And in a lot of organizations where they're trying to do this balance of having the right kind of talent at different locations, they end up creating what we call as the feature teams.
Yes.
Right? Which are primarily taking up the context, and then they're trying to build. Now, there are definitely some, I would say, challenges over there in terms of, like one is you are in a very different time zone. You may have, as you said, lost some amount of context somewhere, right? So, in terms of enabling or empowering such kind of feature teams, what do you think would work? Because they want to make sure that they are also delivering in full potential, high quality, actually solving the problem for which the product is intended for.
So I think empowerment is a pretty important aspect of any team, because I think without empowerment, the good ideas will not emerge. Because I'm of the belief that the best idea doesn't most of the times come from the most highly paid person. It comes from the person who is close to content or closest to source, as you may, right? They are the ones who actually have good ideas, and those ideas could be incremental, disruptive, but true believer of that. So empowered teams are the right way to go. Now, empowerment also comes through two aspects, right? First is you need to feel that there is a trust factor and you feel safe to contribute your ideas. I think they're very important that teams who are global teams who are building for a particular market have some space, mind space to do their own incremental innovation, right? If you cannot translate your ideas and see it to fruition, you're not going to give the idea the next time, right? You're going to realize that, hey, I have a lot of great ideas of how this can happen, but guess what? There is no platform or space for me to express myself. I think giving those teams that kind of spaces, whether it is encouraging them to pick up a few user stories that solves a problem they have identified, right? So you can build that confidence that in fact, me sitting so far away can solve a problem. I think that will create the necessary confidence, okay? Oftentimes the barrier is, we have, if you think about it, very smart empowered teams. We are hiring very smart empowered people who have capability. But I think oftentimes where that ability, translating that potential to results breaks is not giving them the space and the confidence. So I think giving a space through your sprints or whatever you're doing to give some of these individuals ability to contribute is one part. So they create that kind of ecosystem, if you may, to do incremental changes. I think the second one for these teams is seeing some of what they've built being used by a customer and seeing the delight, right? So you're starting to, there are many ways to do it, right? You can insert the team into demos that you're doing, new prospect demos. You can get the team to be part of customer heuristic feedback, even though they're just listening in. They may be just listening in. And then they're seeing what they're building in action. And nothing more empowering than seeing your work being put to use and saying, oh, you know what, that one story, user story, and I wrote a line of code, that's causing such a transformative change from an automation perspective for my customer. And then it doesn't stop, because then you realize that you've had opportunity to not just experiment, but see it firsthand to see, okay, I can make a change, and my line of code or my user story has really made a transformative impact on my customer experience layer. So I think that is the part you'll have to, and you have to celebrate those wins. I think sometimes the focus is so much on the big bets, very important, big bets, very important. But these incremental wins are also very important to create the sense of community within the team to be able to contribute to the customer.
Yeah. No, I mean, completely. I mean, if I can see that these few lines of code that I wrote, what is the impact it has on my customer's pain point, I think that can elevate the empathy to a very, very different level. And the commitment or the...
Everything changes.
Everything changes very distinct, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times also what happens is in this how do I say, race of trying to solve, continuously for, our backlogs are always overflowing.
Always.
They're always running. So how do you, like do this balance between business as usual versus innovation? Because I have been on that journey myself, and I probably never found that perfect balance. We've tried different things, but what has been your experience there?
So that's perhaps one of the most complex problem for any leader to solve, especially very complex for a product leader to solve. So if you look at it, the horizon model has changed significantly over the last few years, right? So within our context, one of the things that we've embraced is have a very structured way of how we invest in what we invest in, right? And we've tried to balance it to be practical as well as focus on the innovation. So we have within our annual and quarterly planning, we use OKRs, we use all of those tool sets, but those are tools. The philosophy simply is that how do you break that backlog into specific channels? To the point I made earlier, one channel is dedicated completely to addressing ongoing customer experience through whatever feedback you've got. It could be when you're deploying, it could be from the customers who are using your software, ongoing feedback. So we've segregated a channel for what we call as customer-driven changes to the product, right? And we try our best to make sure that the customer channel is consistently maintained year on year, so you don't slosh between backlogs, which is a perennial problem. The second one is more about, and these customer-driven channel changes, typically shorter feedback loop, right? You're talking about what you're getting to market in a 4, 6, 8 month time frame through your general availability releases. The second one is really about what are the broader white spaces in your market, right? Because you're learning through market study, you're learning through all the things that are being disruptive technologies in the market, whether it's digital, cloud, AI, watching for those white spaces and making sure you are sufficiently thinking about them and bringing them back into your backlog. And that's what we call a fixed channel, which is more roadmap or market driven. So we've segregated that as a second channel. The third one, and oftentimes in my view, typically underserved, is the fact that when you're building a global product, that foundation of the product, whether it's technology, tools, automation that needs to be built in, needs its own focus. So that's what we call as a foundational investment. And that tends to be things that we know we have to build to future-proof our product. It's definitely not something our customers ask for. It's things that we know that our platform product needs as we scale globally. And that is an ongoing obsession. So I've always found that if we get our teams to think about the horizon model like that, short term, mid term, and then ongoing future proofing. Right. And we've taken it to the extent that every year, whether it's investment, that's how we almost report it internally.
Okay.
Then we
like these three teams.
Yeah, these three teams. And within each of the teams, you have business teams.
Correct.
We're doing stuff on automation, compliance, those become sub-teams. But we've tried to make it as structured as possible between these three teams so that we are not making false choices between compliance and innovation. Because I think they are actually false choices. If you were to ask me, hey, you're going to enter a new market in Europe, there's a huge compliance, and there are compliance mandates that come out quite often for financial services and data protection. Are you going to do that? Or are you going to build some digital experience aspects which is needed for the next 2 years? Answer is yes, we have to find a way to do both. But you have to do both with calibration. Because one is needed in a shorter time horizon, and one is needed, we have time to experiment and harvest the idea before we take to market. Because I think where teams struggle is when you put the same time horizon on both. And I think the teams then feel like, wow, that's a false choice. It is a false choice indeed. And that's why as leaders, you'll have to structure it to kind of balance priorities, if you may. And it's an ongoing thing. I don't think this, what I said is not a silver bullet. It's just an intentional obsession. If you're obsessing about it across these three vectors, then hopefully over a period of time, you are not making short-term trade-offs which will impact you in the long term.
I agree. And then you are not like kind of being short-sighted, or you're looking at multiple aspects.
You have to.
That enables the business as well as tech, all kind of initiatives to thrive.
Yeah, because the other thing that I've seen that can be very detrimental is only focusing on the shiny object, which is, hey, guess what, the market's going here in 2 years, that's all I'm going to focus on. And then what happens to the other two things? And then your customer experience scores drop, or you've realized you made tech choices which are not future ready. So I think you'll have to make sure that you don't go to eat any one of those extremes. Got to bring a balance, and the balance is through how you invest and prioritize. Yeah.
I'm probably going to dig a little deeper into one of those aspects which you spoke about, Roopa, which is that see what happens, especially you have worked on a lot of B2B products, right? So when you're kind of growing globally, right, and across these multiple themes that you spoke about, there could be these team compositions which are kind of at certain different locations. Now, and there I feel the challenge, for example, let's say you are just going into one of the emerging markets. So whether it is legality, compliance, pricing, user behavior, you need to be sensitive to that. Whereas your teams which are actually going to be working on this are sitting very in different locations. So what would be a good way to kind of have the right kind of priority and alignment across the globe? What would be, like, if you had to say like one model that you have seen work, how does that work?
So I'll step back a little bit and explain, when you're taking a product from one primary market to global, what are the kind of lenses you have to wear? There's, of course, the customer experience lens, because it's not apple to apple. One market or one end user and the other end user in another market, not the same. Your common denominators of the product functionality may be the same, but how they would expect experiences, the level of automation, level of operations that they would expect are very different. Even within the market, even when you're operating in North America and Europe, there are things which are very different, right? So that customer experience lens is something that you need to have dedicated focus for. And the way to do it is also, as you enter a new market, there's sufficient market study to know what are those things which are must have, nice to have in that specific market. And those are built on top of the common denominator, which is your product. So that needs its own capability. There, I think local knowledge is very important. So it always helps to build a mix of a local team and a global team working tandem to drive that. So that's the customer experience part. The second one, which is compliance. Compliance is a very, very complex thing to handle, because compliance could be financial, it could be data, it could be even things on technology choices and cloud. There, I think what I have found personally work is on the compliance aspect, make sure you're partnering with the right people who will give you the compliance know-how, at least the primer on what does it mean to operate in this market relative to compliance. Then you are taking that and then you're going to build it, because I think that's something is hard for you to create as a net new competency. It's better to use an ecosystem play, work with partners who help you there. And in terms of go-to-market, which is pricing and things like that, there again, it's a combination of two things: local hiring and partnerships. So I think the minute you go global, I think you are obviously going to think about the under the hood platform from a scale perspective and making sure it's built with the necessary extensibility and configurability, but it doesn't stop there. That's on the product side, but you need the go-to-market and the market nuances, and that oftentimes comes through local hiring and partnerships. Some combination of that, so that you're going in well aware and you're not going in making some what I would call 101 mistakes. So that's what I have seen to work nicely. And of course, once you mature in the market, then you can take a lot more of the capabilities in-house.
I think that is kind of very, very well-rounded. That's a great, how do I say, consolidated view of that. And you, especially, you are somebody who's kind of now building global products from India, right? So what takes you to, let's say, manage your leadership upward, your peers in different locations, manage your team? So if you to succeed as a product leader, and you are both a technology product leader and you have a responsibility of being a site leader, so what's your recipe, success recipe?
So my recipe is just a standard leadership recipe. So I'll go back to the basics: is communication and context is key. And as leaders, no amount of communication is enough. And then communicating consistently about, in my view, the big rocks. But oftentimes I've seen leaders stop with the big rocks and say, I want to do this, this, this. I think the beauty of any strong leader, at least I've worked with a lot of good leaders and mentors, and what I have seen them do is be very strong in translating the big rocks or the vision or the North Star, there are many names for it, into how that can be actualized. So I think there, I think very, very important is strategy execution gap. How do you bridge it as a leader? Oftentimes, it's through communication, working with the teams to deconstruct the idea. And I think that's where have to be a hands-on leader. So not talk about just the big picture, but also sit with your teams to understand how would we achieve it. So I think their communication is key. The second one I would say is cadence. Cadence here can be from a lot of forms. Do you have, I talked earlier about OKRs. Do you have types of structures that constantly force this type of conversation on alignment? Okay, the strategy is this, here's what you're doing on the ground. How are we aligning? Not just as a product or technology team, but a cross-functional team. Because your stakeholders tend to be sales and marketing, and you have teams which are in fact delivering your software, consulting teams. I think they're very important to have that cadence of feedback, and those have good blueprints that organizations can use, but that it's super intentional. Communication, context, cadence, for me, those have been front and center, because if you don't have one of those, I think you struggle in a global setup. Because it's no more, all of us are on the same, product floor. We can walk to each other. Context is hard. You have to explain. You have to invest in it.
All right. So let's get into our rapid fire round. What's your favorite productivity hack?
Productivity hack. I think for me, productivity hack is really spending time with my family. Because I think that energizes me. Because I think productivity will come, but if you're not energized, it's hard. So for me, it's just making sure I spend time with family, come back energized. Because I think more and more, it's about how do you blend work and life.
Agreed.
Right? So I think that's been a productivity hack. When my son was younger, it was hanging out with him. Now he's a teen. So it's like, okay, can I listen to music he's listening to so I can have common topics to talk to him? So I think that's simple.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
What is the most overrated leadership catchphrase?
So since we talked a lot about communication, right? So the most overrated leadership catchphrase is big picture. So everyone talks about big picture, and as I said earlier, very important. Big picture and vision is very important. But I think oftentimes what's more important is how do you translate it and make a person connect to it? So I think big picture I've heard a lot. I think it makes me laugh because you'll have to, again, strategy and execution, how do you bridge it?
Yeah, translate.
Yeah, translation service is super critical. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Biggest myth about remote work?
I think the biggest myth about remote work is that there are only two options. It's remote or in person. I'm not a believer that there are only two options. I think we'll have to find a middle ground so we can balance flexibility and in-person time, right? So I think that's what I would say is the biggest myth.
Right.
Yeah.
What model has worked best for in your knowledge? Product owner, business analyst, or a product manager in a remote team?
I think it's a spectrum, right? So you have people who start early years as more an analyst, understanding the system functionality. But I think having that product thinking, getting into a product owner and product manager role is when you start to kind of step back and understand the customer nuances. I don't see it as an either or, it's a career continuum. So I always urge people not to get bogged down by titles and roles. It's about, okay, what are you doing in the role? Are you understanding what the customer needs? What are you building? How are you building it and validating it? And sometimes organizations get bent out of shape on these titles. Very important from a pyramid perspective. But what's more important is the career journey. And how do you straddle between these roles and make sure you can become, in fact, a product leader.
Agreed. Yeah. And you don't have to draw these hard lines of.
It's not needed. It's not needed at all.
I think
if you have the right mindset and curiosity, I've seen analysts give great ideas which a product manager has looked back and said, hey, wow, that's a great idea. Let's take it into the product roadmap. Yes. I think having a little bit of boundaryless thinking is important.
Fantastic. Very well said.
Yeah.
There is, I really wish I had more time. There is, just so many of layers that we have.
It's a very layered topic. I'm sure if you let us alone, we can talk to it for hours and hours and days.
Correct.
I think, but it's a very interesting topic. I think I always think it's a great time for people who are working in India and globally to be part of the product revolution.
I agree.
Because I think it's filled with learning, filled with a lot of exciting stuff.
Correct.
But I think the growth mindset is important. You should be willing to learn.
Yeah. That is true. That is true. And I'm seeing, just the the interest in the, for example, in the Gen
community,
Z, in the community, right, to kind of do it better and get improve their craft is just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yep.